Hello, this is Erica with Launching Legacies. Welcome to our daily devotional. Today we are we're starting a devotional that I mentioned yesterday on the Sabbath. And so this is called Sabbath for Man, and it comes from a passage in Mark that I want to use to kind of reference what the use of the Sabbath is. So Mark, the second chapter, and the 27th verse says, "Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is the Lord, even over the Sabbath." All right, so let's talk about the context of that passage. So in this passage, Jesus is discussing with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, that accuse him and his disciples of breaking the Sabbath. So what's happened is they were walking through a field on the Sabbath, and the disciples were taking the heads off of the grain and eating them. Okay. And according to the laws of this tradition of the Pharisees, they were not permitted to work on the Sabbath, and that would be considered work to harvest the grain, even if they were just, popping it in their mouths or whatever. And so they reminded Jesus of the situation in which David and his men were breaking the Sabbath by eating stuff that they weren't supposed to eat. And that's an Old Testament story. And so they reminded him of that, and they're like, well, you're breaking the Sabbath. Basically, this is what's happening. You're breaking the Sabbath. And so Jesus is like, well, his response is, no, look, the Sabbath was made for man, or for people, right? And depending on what translation, man is universal, so man meaning man and woman. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? And so it's like people weren't made to serve the Sabbath requirements. The Sabbath was made as a requirement for man. And so we go back, if we look at the beginning of the establishment of the Sabbath, it's quite interesting. Actually, before it's established in the scriptures, before it's established as a requirement for people, for man in the scriptures, it's something that happens in Genesis. And so I want to go back to Genesis. And actually, this I'm going to read from. I'm going to read from one of my Bibles, so excuse me really quickly. I should have pulled it down first. But I'm going to read from a Bible and talk about how God actually first introduces the Sabbath in a non-traditional way. He doesn't call it the Sabbath, but he takes rest. And so let's read that passage. We're going to read it in the King James Version, and then look at what implications it has as we move forward into the scriptures. Okay, and so we're in Genesis, the first chapter, and sorry, I don't know why I didn't mark my page. And we're at the end of the first chapter in the 26th verse. I feel like it's the 31st verse. Oh, sorry. So actually, we go to the 31st verse and we move into the second verse of Genesis. It starts with, so this is Genesis 1:31, and then we're going to read down because it's necessary to kind of get the context. So, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very beautiful. Okay, that's Genesis 1:31, and this is after the creation of everything. And then the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Now, God had created man and woman on that. And at this time, now thus the heavens and the earth were finished, right? So he finished that, and all the hosts of them. And the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day for all his work which he had made. Okay, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made. Okay. These are the generations of the heavens of the earth. Okay, so when we go to Genesis 1 and we incorporate this passage from Mark 2, we see that God is using the seventh day, which becomes the Sabbath, as a day of rest from all of his work. Now, it's interesting because many people think, okay, well, the Sabbath, the rest implies that a person is tired, okay? And actually the scripture doesn't say that. And so I want to kind of talk about that really quickly. That why would God need rest, or why would he call the seventh day a time of rest if God is all powerful and he wouldn't necessarily need rest, right? He's all powerful. He's never failing. His love never fails. And so we would assume also his energy never fails. He's an unfailing God. He's not taking breaks. The scripture says he neither sleeps nor he slumbers, right? And that's another passage in the scripture. So is this a conflicting paradigm? And my suggestion here is no, that God uses the Sabbath and sanctifies the Sabbath as a day of rest, not necessarily because he needs rest, but as a model to us for rest. And so we're going to explore another day. And another day, we're going to explore what he does as he establishes the Sabbath with the children of Israel. That's later on in the scriptures. But when we go back to Genesis here, it says that he sanctifies this day, the Sabbath day, and he goes into and he uses this seventh day as a day of rest. Now, when he does that, again, man is already created. And I think that what's important for us to garnish from this place is that he sanctifies it, he makes it holy, and it is the seventh day, it's the Sabbath day. But there are generations and generations of people who lived before he actually establishes the rule of rest on the seventh day. And I'm sure that he knows that won't come for quite a bit of time. And in the between periods, man is not commanded for the Sabbath rest, but rather it is an implied practice of God as he sanctifies that seventh day. And so what am I going to propose here? I'm going to propose that even before God establishes the Sabbath as a rule or a law for the people of Israel, that it's a practice because he practices it from the beginning. In other words, we don't ever hear Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel talking about the Sabbath, right? We see them making sacrifices, so we know that they're doing something in communicating with God, or bringing an offering to God, but we don't hear that they actually observe the Sabbath. But despite the fact that we don't hear it, we see that God has practiced it after the creation of man. And so what we can assume is that he's resting and demonstrating this rest as an example for us, because the scripture says he doesn't sleep nor does he slumber. So that assumption means he doesn't get tired, right? He doesn't get exhausted. So what is the Sabbath rest actually for? It is for man, essentially, because it's definitely not for God. He didn't need to rest. Okay, he didn't need to rest from a weary life. He didn't need to rest because he was overwhelmed. The scripture doesn't say that. He says that he rested, but then he sanctified and he called the day holy, which is very interesting. And so when we go back to this passage in Mark and we look at that with this passage in Genesis, we put them together and we get this concept that somehow God has created this Sabbath day and established the Sabbath day even from the beginning in order to establish something that we needed, right? Something that we were going to require, which is a time of rest. We need a time of rest in order to stay balanced. So even though the New Testament is saying that, he's saying, of course, Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't need to practice utilizing this concept of a Sabbath. But also what Jesus is admonishing the Pharisees here about is that he's like, look, at the Sabbath their requirements don't bombard me. In other words, we're not going to be legalistic about this. The Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was made so that we could enjoy it and so that we can find rest. And so although there seems to be a pressing need for the Sabbath, it's necessary, it's still not created in order to bombard or overwhelm the people who are practicing the use of the Sabbath. In other words, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do this, I can't do that. So I can't get anything done because I'm on the Sabbath is not necessarily the right position according to Mark the 2nd chapter as Jesus is speaking. On the other hand, God establishes the Sabbath in Genesis, the the second chapter, so Mark 2, Genesis 2, God is establishing the use of the Sabbath even though he doesn't himself need rest from work. And so there's something else then in that word Sabbath. If it's not rest from work, it has some other implications. And so we're going to explore those as we go through the days of looking at the Sabbath and what that implies. But as you get prepared for those devotionals, would you read Mark the second chapter? Would you also read Genesis the second chapter and look at what God is doing? Maybe Genesis start with the first chapter and read into the second because it's kind of important. But at the same time, would you check yourself? How have you regarded the Sabbath? What has it been for you? Maybe for you, you've been more like the Pharisees and you're like, I have to follow these rules. I have to keep it on this day. I have to do these things. I don't know. Or maybe you've been a person who's disregarded the Sabbath and they thought it wasn't important or significant to you because you're a New Testament believer. Or maybe neither one of those applies to you. I'm not really sure what your situation is, but I want to encourage you to explore time in looking at the Sabbath and what it means as an idea of rest, a model of rest for humans. And we'll see you again tomorrow with another of our devotionals. Until then, be blessed.